Yeah, great. Well, welcome everybody. I am Brian Christie. I am the 2024 president of the Crowdfunding Professional Association. I'm very happy to be here with Brendan Ballou, who's the author of Plunder, and Devin Thorpe, who is the 2023 president of CFPA and who will moderate today's session. CFPA is the leading trade association in the regulated investment crowdfunding space, and we represent many of the stakeholders in crowdfunding. And we work to advance the industry. We work to educate folks in the industry, and really work to advocate the agenda to better the industry. The reason why we're having today's session is that we believe, many of us believe, that not all capital is created equal, and it's important to look at the way that different types of capital investment are structured, and how that impacts the companies they're investing in, the people that are affected by that, various policies that sort of are implicated as a result of that. And we believe it's important to contrast some of what happens under regulated crowdfunding with other forms of capital, such as venture capital or private equity. And it's no secret, given the title of Brendan's book, that he offers a bit of an indictment on some of the problems associated with private equity. And so I'm not spoiling things by mentioning that. And so I've read the book. I love it. I think it's great. I think it really provides, personally, a looking at some of the inner workings of things that are happening that people may not realize what's sort of affecting them or affecting the companies they may be interacting with. So I really look forward to this conversation. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Devin, who will take it from here.
Well, thank you very, very much. I want to just pause and acknowledge that Brian's firm, Crowdfund Holdings, is a sponsor for our webinar series. And so we're grateful to him and his firm. So Brian, thank you very, very much. Brendan, we're thrilled to have you. Let me just provide a little introduction. Brendan is the author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. He served as the special counsel for private equity in the Justice Department's, let's see, what was it? The private equity...
the antitrust
division, right? Yep. Yeah. And previously, he worked in private practice, and before that in the National Security Division of the Justice Department. And his work, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Nation. So we are thrilled and honored to have Brendan with us. Brendan, let me jump in quickly and just to help us frame today's discussion. I wonder if you would share your personal journey and what inspired you to write such a thoughtful book about private equity. Oops, we want you to unmute.
That's there. After all of these, after years of doing Zoom, you'd think you'd get better at this after a time. But no, well, thank you so much, and thank you for calling it a thoughtful book. I should say, of course, that I'm speaking here in a purely personal capacity and not on behalf of my employer. So I got interested in private equity, speaking of Zoom, during quarantine. During that time, we all had, or many of us had, free time on our hands, and I started looking at sort of all these acquisitions that were happening across the country. And it seemed like they were happening, you could just read about them in the newspapers. It seemed like they were happening by companies that we had never heard of, or I had never heard of, Blackstone and Carlyle and KKR. And that got me started to research, what are these firms? What is private equity? And I felt like there were a lot of really great stories out there about sort of private equity acquisitions in specific industries, but very few people were telling sort of an overarching story about what private equity was and what kind of effect it was having on the country. And that's what led me to this project.
Well, the book is brilliant. I was listening to the book. I did the audio book and driving around with my wife, and she was listening with me. And she just kept saying, "This makes me so mad. This makes me so mad." For the benefit of people who haven't yet read the book, what do you see as the kind of the fundamental problem with private equity as it's being practiced in America today?
I love that question. And maybe I should give the viewers or the audience participants just a sort of basic primer on what private equity is, and then talk a little bit about what these problems are. So the basic business model of private equity is very simple. So private equity firms take a little bit of their own money, maybe 1 or 2% of an acquisition cost, some investor money, so money from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so forth, and then a whole lot of borrowed money to buy up businesses, which they then try to flip for a profit in 3 or 5 or 7 years, whatever it happens to be. So very simple business model. But to get to your question, what are the problems with the private equity business model? I see them, there's really 3 basic issues. One is, and it's sort of inherent into the description that I just had, is that private equity firms tend to invest just for a few years. They're trying to flip the company for a profit, as short as 2 or 3 years. And how long you invest in something changes your perspective on it. It changes whether you're going to invest in your employees, in your infrastructure, if you're going to treat your company and your customers well. So that's the first problem. The second problem, and again, this is sort of inherent in the business model, is a reliance on debt and fees. So when private equity firms buy up businesses, they do so with a lot of debt. But the really interesting thing is it's debt that the company they buy is responsible for paying. So when KKR and Vornado and Bain buy up Toys R Us, it's the responsibility for paying the cost of most of that acquisition rests not with the private equity firms, but with Toys R Us. And at the same time, private equity firms, as they're loading these companies up with debt, are able to extract a lot of fees. So management fees, which are fees paid for the privilege of being owned by a private equity firm, transaction fees, which are paid when you have a big sale, and so forth. All of which are ways that private equity firms can kind of extract money from a business. The final problem is the one that interests me the most as a lawyer, which is that private equity firms are very good at insulating themselves from the legal consequences of their actions. So if something goes wrong at a company that's owned by a private equity firm, generally it's very hard to hold the private equity firm responsible, even if the private equity firm has essentially operational control over the business. And so to wrap up a very long answer to your very straightforward question, when you combine all of those problems, short-term thinking, reliance on debt and fees, insulation from liability, private equity firms tend to benefit when things go well at the companies they buy, but get to walk away when things go poorly. And that sort of mismatch of incentives, I think, helps to explain why there have so often been bad consequences with these acquisitions.
Let's talk about so often just a little bit. Are we talking about a few bad apples, or are we talking about a pervasive problem? How prevalent is the practice of private equity, and how much of it is being managed in a poor way? You admit in the book that some private equity firms are doing a good job of investing in companies and helping them grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to sort of overstate my case and say that every private equity acquisition is going to end in disaster. So to set a baseline here, just in terms of the scale of private equity, it's enormous. Private equity firms are regularly spending over $1 trillion on acquisitions every year. And the entire US GDP, so our output every year, is about $25 trillion. So it's not an insubstantial part of the American economy. One study found that private equity portfolio companies, so the companies that are bought up by private equity firms, are about 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as similarly situated companies that aren't bought up by private equity firms. And so it's a comparison, I think, over a 10-year period of 20% to 2%. So about 1 in 5 private equity owned acquisitions are going to go bankrupt, according to this one study. Now, a lot of companies can struggle even if they don't necessarily go bankrupt. But I don't want to say that every deal is going to go poorly. What I always say is it's a little bit like the Ford Pinto of the 1970s. It's like not every one of the Pintos needed it to explode for it to be unsafe at any speed. It's inherent in the design of the car that it becomes dangerous. And I think it's something sort of analogous with private equity. And I should say this is not because of necessarily the people in private equity. It's because of the legal incentives and structures that we have around it that sort of incentivize sort of this short-term risky behavior.
Yeah, and the implications of that risky behavior go beyond the financial markets, don't they? You in the book, you talk about manor care and the quality of care, and quite frankly, the deaths, unnecessary deaths that appear to have resulted from the private equity ownership of this national chain of nursing homes. Can you walk us through the implications of private equity in manor care and help us connect the dots between financial machinations and maybe people dying?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the sort of most important examples to my mind, which is back in, I believe, 2007, Carlisle bought up HCR Manor Care, which at the time was the second largest nursing home chain in the United States. They then executed a series of tactics that I think are fairly familiar to observers of the private equity industry. So they required Manor Care to sell off their real estate and then lease it back to itself. So, that's a way for the nursing home and the private equity firm to generate a quick hit of cash because you're selling off assets. But now you're responsible for paying a lease on something that you used to own. There were staffing cuts, health code violations spiked, and at least one resident died. She, according to her family's subsequent complaint, she had to go to the bathroom by herself in an understaffed facility. She hit her head, died of subdural hematoma. When her family sues for wrongful death, Carlisle was able to get the case against it dismissed. And what it said is, we are not the technical owners of the nursing home chain. Rather, we merely advise a series of funds whose limited partners, through several shell companies, own the nursing home chain. And that's enough to get the case against it dismissed because they basically say we weren't responsible, even though we had operational control. And so it goes back to what we were talking about, these sort of basic problems with the business model, where the private equity firms, through their acquisitions, often can execute operational control over the business. And yet when something goes wrong, they can walk away.
Yeah, there was an interesting echo of your analysis around manor care in a recent study published by researchers at Harvard Medical School that concluded that patients are more likely to fall, get new infections, or experience other forms of harm during their stay in a hospital after the hospital is acquired by a private equity firm. The increases are seen in conditions or outcomes deemed preventable that are key measures of hospital safety and quality. What do you think is going on here in the PE model for the healthcare sector? And it's
Yeah.
kind of scary.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really interesting case because private equity is just enormously interested in the healthcare industry generally. It makes up a sixth of the economy. So, they've been acquiring, not just hospitals and individual medical practices, but sort of the whole supply chain of medical care in the United States, from, developing drugs and so forth to, sort of handling coding when you're, submitting bills to Medicare and Medicaid. The challenge that we've got is private equity firms often have a very, very short-term perspective on these, and again, can generally walk away if things aren't going in their direction. One of the stories that's been in the news recently, sort of piggybacking off the Harvard study that you just mentioned, was Cerberus's acquisition of the Steward healthcare chain in Massachusetts. So after Cerberus bought it up, it implemented new software to supposedly do sort of more efficient management of staffing. But as a result, according to subsequent complaints, these places were dramatically understaffed, and dramatically understaffed at core times, like the outbreak of COVID-19, where at one hospital, the situation was so dire and so poorly equipped that they had the essentially COVID wing and the non-COVID wing. And the only thing that was separating them was the sort of hospital sheet that you might have between patients in a shared room. Um, So, you have a situation like that, and yet, the founder of Cerberus is, remains a billionaire several times over. So it's a little concerning because I think people are just starting to wrap their heads around the scope of private equity's ambition here, and yet there's sort of so much more that I think the private equity industry is going to do before, a lot of state regulators, journalists, and so forth catch up to them.
Yeah. Let me ask another question. Maybe it's a two-parter, but in your book, you talk about how extractive the private equity industry is oftentimes from people of very modest means. For instance, they have some exploitive practices in the mobile home park. And maybe we could just stop here. Let me just ask this question, and I'll ask a follow-up. But as you think about, as you looked at this, what is going on that some of the richest people in the world, including the LPs who are benefiting from this, are pulling their money out of low-income communities? It just seems wrong.
Yeah. This was something I say often, that something that surprised me in researching this book was I sort of thought that private equity firms would target industries that service rich people because that's sort of where the money is. But to my surprise, I think private equity firms often went after industries that target working class or poor people. And I think the reason for that is often those customers really don't have an alternative. And so they are situations where you can raise the prices, cut the quality of care, and there's really nothing that the customers can do anything about. So you mentioned mobile homes. I'd add to that for-profit colleges, prison services. So phone companies, commissaries, cafeterias, healthcare for prisons, all enormously popular with private equity. To stick with the health or with the mobile home situation specifically that you raised, that was a really interesting story, and it goes back to Carlisle, which one of the stories that I was really interested in was their acquisition of a mobile home park in the Bay Area. Mobile home, a famously expensive part of the country to live in. Mobile homes were sort of the last bastion of affordability in some of these areas. Carlisle bought it up, then significantly raised lot rents at the mobile homes. And this is a really tragic sort of little detail of how mobile home parks work. So oftentimes a mobile home resident will own the physical structure that the house itself, but then pay what's called a lot rent for the ground underneath. And we call them mobile homes. It's a bit of a misnomer. Many of these homes can in fact be moved. So by raising the lot rent, not only were you increasing how much these residents had to pay every month, you were also effectively lowering the value of the home because it meant that there were fewer people that were going to be able to buy it instead. And so it was sort of this pincer move that both, it took money from people's incomes, but also subtracted from their wealth. And the extent to which the mobile home residents were just completely outgunned by Carlisle in this was really extraordinary. The LA Times did really important reporting about how residents would literally collect cans in order to afford time to meet with a lawyer. They had a quote about how they had connected enough cans to afford a third hour with an attorney. So I think, it's illustrative, but it's hardly exhaustive or unusual in that I think private equity firms are really drawn to these sorts of industries. To put a final button on it, Carlisle was in the news just yesterday, and that David Rubenstein, the co-founder of the Carlisle Group, put some of his money towards buying the Orioles. So he's obviously has been fabulously successful in business, and now is pursuing other activities.
Yeah, the wealthy get to do that. One of the things that we think a lot about here at the Crowdfunding Professional Association is the idea that crowdfunding can provide a different approach to addressing some of the same issues, looking at the same transactions. And I want to just ask you kind of the hypothetical. If we were going to try to use crowdfunding, which would enable members of the residents of a mobile home park, among others, to invest in the park and take the ownership from whoever might be selling it, including perhaps a private equity firm. What would be the precautions? What would be the changes? What would you want to see the owners in this community structure doing differently to provide some community benefit while still hopefully providing some benefit in the ownership, right? We don't want to ignore that it's an investment. How would you think about that?
Yeah. Well, and I confess I can really only speak to, in some sense, the challenges of the private equity business model. I'm less qualified to speak to the alternatives of other kinds of business models, but I think it's a good and I think it's a fair question. I think whatever sort of, let me take a step back. I think that investment is an important part, and the financial system is an essential part of our economy. You always need somebody to put up the money to help build a new factory or construct a new home or to hire somebody else. The question then is, how do you do that in a fair and sort of pro-social way while hopefully making a profit? I think one of the key things to be thinking about is, let's say, to use your example, you're talking about a mobile home park, is, okay, how can I invest here, or how can my institution here invest with a long-term perspective? Some of the most extractive tactics that you see going on here are ones that are motivated by the need to make a profit in just a few years. The previous owners of that mobile home park, I believe, were a multi-generation family that had been, operating the place for decades. And I think that there was some reporting saying, it's not like these people are running this thing as a charity, but, they can have some sort of flexibility. They understand that, maybe the rent is not going to work for this person by the 1st, but if we give them until the 8th, they're going to be able to stay in their home. And that's actually going to be better for everyone. So I think, figuring out how to invest for the long term is going to be important. The other thing is aligning decision making with responsibility, and you can sort of interpret that as broadly or as narrowly as you want. As a lawyer, I think of this in terms of liability, but the way that I think about it is, if you are the person making a decision on an investment or a product or a property, you should be the one that's legally responsible for the consequences. And that forces you to think through, what are those consequences? The challenge that we've got is, at least in the private equity world, an enormous amount of work and thinking is done to help sort of separate control and responsibility. In fact, I was on a podcast with a very nice private equity executive who said that, yes, this is a consideration that we make in the sorts of investments that we do. So I think if you're able to take a long-term perspective, and if you're able to align responsibility and control, I think the outcome is going to be a lot more productive for the world, and hopefully you're going to still be able to make money.
Yeah. Great advice there. Coming back to the private equity space, it seems we need to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment. Of course, this is your expertise, right? Could you just maybe walk us through some of the regulations that exist, maybe comment on what should exist, and put into this context, I realize this is a big question, put into this context a little bit about what the PE firms are presently doing to navigate these rules and to lobby in Washington for preservation of these gaps that they're using for their business. It's a lot to take in, but I wonder if you kind of just give us that overview of the regulatory environment.
Yeah, so perhaps at the risk of giving a long answer here, I think I'll tackle the last part first. The sort of lobbying power of the private equity industry is extraordinary, maybe unrivaled in American industry. Private equity firms, I think, have contributed over $900 million. Private equity and investment firms have contributed over $900 million to federal candidates and elected officials over the past few decades. The people that work for private equity firms now include a former vice president, 2 former speakers of the House, former secretaries of state, defense, the last 3 secretaries of Treasury, I believe, as well as any number of Congress people and senators and so forth, which has made them really, I think, uniquely successful in advocating for their agenda, sort of on Capitol Hill and in front of regulators. To give just one of many examples, the carried interest loophole has been, won't get into the weeds here, but it essentially allows private equity executives to often pay an effective lower tax rate than, certainly I pay, most people pay. This has been something that has been a bipartisan target of attack and attempted reform. The last 3 presidents, Biden, Trump, and Obama, have all tried to end the carried interest loophole. None of them have succeeded. There have been some minor tweaks around the edges, but it still survives essentially intact, which speaks to, if 3 presidents can't get it done, it suggests that you're pretty successful at your job in advancing your sort of regulatory agenda. So to tackle the first part of your question, then, in terms of sort of what is and what could be, private part of the reason I think private equity firms have been so successful over the past 15 years has been that there's been an enormous amount of regulatory pressure put on investment banks. As in the Great Recession, they all converted into bank holding companies, which are regulated by the Federal Reserve. And as a result, they kind of became less sort of interesting in a sense. They just a lot less financially adventurous. And a lot of that innovation, for better or worse, sort of shifted to private equity firms, which are vastly less regulated. If you're familiar with sort of SEC regulations, by comparison, the private equity industry, this is overstating a little bit, really is governed by one form that they have to file with the SEC, Form PF. So I think that there's a lot that can be done here. To go back to the original problems that we were talking about sort of short-term thinking, reliance on debt and fees, insulation from liability, you can tackle a lot of those problems either through, you can always turn to Congress and push for legislation, but in the absence of that, there's a lot that regulators can do on, from the SEC to the Treasury Department to the Federal Reserve to states and localities, pushing to stop sort of the most extractive tactics that private equity firms engage in. So all that is a very long way of saying, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done, but I also think that there's a lot that can be done. And there are a lot of different levers of regulation and legislation and litigation that can help move that forward.
One of the problems you hinted at in Plunder is the conflict of interest between the private equity general partners and the limited partners. The general partners can make profits on deals even when the limited partners don't. Perhaps the most egregious example of this is, and you mentioned this already, is the fees that the general partners charge to the portfolio companies, right? So these are fees that go directly from the portfolio company to the general partners, not to the limited partners. And those fees reduce the value in the same way you were talking about the mobile home, right? The mobile home park, right? So you take cash out of the business, and by so doing, you reduce the value of that business relative to what it would be. Even if it's still worth a lot, it's worth less than it would be if it weren't paying those fees. It seems like there's an opportunity for LPs to
Yeah.
play a role in reforming this industry, but I don't see any movement in that direction. What do you think about that?
Great question. So yeah, to um, develop your point exactly like you said, there are any number of fees that private equity firms can demand or extract from portfolio companies that go directly to them, not to the pension funds, not to the sovereign wealth funds, not to the endowments that invest alongside of them. And it leads to, I think, actually a lot of confusion in the public reporting of some of the least successful private equity acquisitions. So, I already alluded to the PE acquisition of Toys R Us. After that happened, there was widespread reporting that, I think KKR said, well, we lost money on the deal. Dan Primack over at Axio says, well, maybe the LPs lost money on the deal, but if you just look at the fee schedule, KKR almost certainly made money. And, you sort of see similar things happening with other acquisitions that, quote unquote, failed. They may have failed for the company, for the customers, for the employees, even for the LPs, but they may not necessarily fail for the private equity firm itself. So I think that that's a very good point. I do agree that private equity firm, that LPs have some theoretical leverage to sort of demand changes here. I think I share your sort of confusion or interest in trying to understand why that hasn't happened yet. I see private equity firms sort of winning on arguments around fees, but also things like fiduciary duties, where nominally a private equity firm would owe a fiduciary duty to an LP, but they'll regularly contract that away and say, actually, we do not, in fact, owe you a fiduciary duty. And the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds not only have allowed that, as far as I know, some of them have advocated against SEC rulemaking that would stop that. So it seems like there's an enormous amount of sort of power that the private equity firms in turn seem to have over the LPs. I think the one last thing that I would add to that, clearly you've been thinking about this, is I am really interested in the power of public advocacy on some of these issues. These are really in the weeds topics, but they're really important. Many, if not most of these pension funds, are state institutions that have public meetings. And we've seen success in advocacy on some of these pension funds, in terms of not investing in PE acquisitions of certain prison services, for instance. I'd be really interested to see if there was sort of a similar movement to try to, push these private equity firms to, think a little bit more for the long term, both for the LPs and for the companies that they're buying.
Yeah, I think that's. I appreciate you digging into this with us. It is an intriguing problem. One of our participants today was asking kind of a follow-up question on the opportunity to leverage the LPs in reform, and he was asking about the LPs and their ability to perhaps bring greater pressure for better ESG reporting.
Yeah.
As you've looked at this, do you see any potential to get, broadly speaking, greater accountability and more narrowly on this question of ESG reporting? Do you think there's hope there, and are LPs the path?
The short answer is I'm hopeful. I mentioned this very briefly, but I'll just expand on this. So on the success around prison phone services. So private equity firms, a handful of them got very interested in buying up prison phone companies and then raising the rates that prisoners would have to pay for very short calls. We're talking, over a minute a call in, institutions where people might be getting paid cents an hour. So, really, really tough situation. Through a handful of advocacy groups, they were actually able to stop, I believe, some pension funds investments in private equity firms that were engaged in this business. And since then, this has become a much less attractive business for private equity firms. I think at least some of them now might consider them sort of losing investments. So I've seen some success in this area generally. I have not seen success on ESG issues specifically. Not that I've seen failures, I just haven't seen one thing either way. I know that institutions like the Private Equity Stakeholder Project have been particularly interested in this. They've been doing a lot of advocacy around, I believe, KKR and others' investments in fossil fuel companies. So I think that there is a real possibility here, because you see private equity firms running out of places to get money, I guess would be the short way of putting it. They have increasingly tapped out on pension funds, and so now are moving to, okay, let's buy up insurance companies, let's try to move into the 401k business and so forth, which suggests to me that maybe pension funds are going to have more and more power on this issue over time.
Yeah, there is real potential. I think the pension funds clearly are one of the big sectors of LPs, and they have that fiduciary responsibility. That's a great point. We've got a couple of great questions from the audience today. Let me just drop one in. One that says, I work with a handful of angel investment groups who are interested in supporting social enterprises, mission-driven, for-profit or nonprofit orgs, and I often wrangle with what's right concerning ROI and SROI expectations. That is, should anyone square up profit versus impact? And as a parallel, what they ask is, can you speak to any non-extractive PE organizations or sectors? And so there's a lot to unwrap there, but see if you can tackle that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, on the last part, I've seen some examples of private equity firms that have had successes with businesses. I've given this example. I believe it's Gray Wolf Capital or Blue Wolf Capital that bought up a timber mill in Arkansas, really revived the whole mill, did it with equity, maintain a seat on the board, kind of took a long-term perspective, helped to revive this small town, which is really great. And I think that there are, private equity firms that are trying to do the right thing in this space. It kind of goes back to, my negative framing in some sense earlier, where I said, I don't really think that the challenges of private equity are about the people in the industry. It's about the laws and regulations around it. And unfortunately, I think that means that it's very hard to have success in the classic leveraged buyout model. I should say success in a sort of pro-social sense, because as long as you've got a capital gains rate that doesn't particularly incentivize long-term investing, and as long as you are able to buy up the company with debt that the company itself is going to hold, and then you couple it with insulation from liability, you're just going to be incentivized towards sort of short-term extractive thinking. Now, I think the best way that you could naturally avoid that would be to ask yourself, okay, how is this acquisition actually going to happen? Are you relying primarily on debt, or is this an equity investment? Are you, sort of putting your own figurative skin in the game on this thing? I think will change your perspective. And then again, what is your perspective on control and responsibility here? If you expect to have control but no responsibility, your incentives are just going to drive you towards a short-term outcome. Whereas if you align those, where if you're empowering a decision maker who ultimately is going to be responsible for the consequences of her or his decisions, I think you're much more likely to have a pro-social outcome. I should, sort of the code on all of this is something that I've tried to, sort of weave through this discussion is, there is a role for finance to play in all of these things. And I don't believe that, we need to fundamentally change our system of capitalism or change human nature to give it a better outcome here. We just need to put some more guardrails around the private equity industry so that all that ambition and all of that drive is channeled in a more pro-social direction rather than a less pro-social one.
Yeah, I appreciate you addressing that. I know a lot of the people in our community see the benefits that are occurring through crowdfunding seemingly natively, automatically. better funding for women, better funding for minorities, better funding for communities. And so we're looking to build on those natural tools. So I appreciate you addressing that thoughtfully. Brian Becken, an attorney in the audience, asks if the problem largely arises from the limited liability that business entities afford, could a solution be to eliminate limited liability? That would require changes in state law, but is this a change we should push for?
That's a great question. I don't think we need to sort of radically rethink the corporation the nature of the corporation to solve sort of the private equity problem. I mean, I think that there are all sorts of challenges that we have in the public company model, but there's sort of a different set of things that we need to think about. For the private equity world, in some sense, you're asking this as sort of lawyer to lawyer. I think that this is really an area where the intentions of the law are fairly clear, but sort of the Delaware Chancery Courts and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court haven't really caught up to the facts of how corporations, some of these institutions or entities are organized right now. To get into the weeds a little bit, what'll often happen is the actual acquisition that's acquiring the company will be a fund or a sort of cluster of legal entities that constitute the fund. And then the private equity firm is not the owner, but will still have essentially operational control over the fund through a limited partnership agreement, what's called a limited partnership agreement. And so I think if you can educate sort of the lawyers and the judges in the system about literally just how these are organized, and that while on paper, a private equity firm might not be sort of the majority stakeholder in a corporation, at the same time, they in fact do have operational control. And if you, I think, can do that education work, I confess I'm not a corporations lawyer or a securities lawyer. I suspect that most judges would be able to sort of catch up and sort of recognize where responsibility lays.
Yeah, that is a fascinating approach, and you address that in the book. I think it's worth let me take this moment just to encourage people in the audience to get the book and read it. We're covering a lot of great content. We're spinning a little bit outside of what's in the book in some cases, but the book is fascinating. I want to encourage you to get it and read it. It is a great book. One of the things that you have touched on already a couple of times that we want to follow up on is this intriguing idea that I think is surprising to a lot of people outside the practice. A private equity firm, the general partner, can conceivably make a profit in a bankruptcy. You talked about Toys R Us. You dig into this in the book a little bit. Walk us through how this works and how pervasive you think this. How often is this happening? The GPs are making a profit while their LPs lose, and the employees. I mean, think of all the ramifications, the money lost in a bankruptcy. It's tragic.
It's really interesting. And, one of the things that I've been told by bankruptcy lawyers is one of the challenges that we've got is, the fees that we've been talking about to private equity firms are essentially considered, fees to financial institutions, as sort of a necessity of operating as a going concern. And so it's rather than as sort of illicit payments to a secret owner or whatever it happens to be. So it's very hard to claw those fees back through the bankruptcy process. And so, you sort of have there will be blood, I drink your milkshake sort of situation where you have sort of this extraction ongoing. And then when the business collapses, it's going to be very hard to get that money back. One of the tactics that I was very interested in was this sort of move. I'll describe it with this company that I've talked about before, is the diner chain Friendly's, which was this chain up in the Northeast. Was bought up by Sun Capital, I believe around 2007, executed a lot of standard tactics, pushed the company into bankruptcy. What happened at that point was Friendly's wasn't just owned by Sun Capital. Sun Capital was also Friendly's largest lender, which is interesting. And, in the bankruptcy process, it's a little bit like flipping an hourglass where, the lenders, at least theoretically, can kind of become the owners of the company. By being on sort of both ends of the hourglass, Sun Capital was able to sell Friendly's from itself to itself. And it was a very complicated move. And the reason that they did that is that they were then able to push the pension obligations that Friendly's had onto what's called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which is this quasi-government agency that's responsible for paying off unfunded pension obligations. And so I bring that up just to say that, I think private equity firms may or may not be good at running sort of operational businesses, but many of them are exceptionally adept at, sort of navigating the legal and specifically the bankruptcy process in order to advantage themselves in a way that I think very few other institutions or companies are so successful at doing.
We've talked a little bit about PE firms playing in mobile home parks, but there are other aspects where they're playing in real estate. And one of the most troubling is the pattern of buying up single family homes. You address this thoughtfully in the book. Why don't you walk us through what you're seeing there, what the problems are, and if you've got suggestions for how municipalities and states can address this to create, more genuinely affordable housing, please let us know.
So, yeah, this was really the outgrowth of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. You had huge tracts of homes that were being foreclosed upon. And the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which had, I think, a financial interest in something like 47% of all mortgages in the United States. So really were the institutions that could do something about this. Probably the rational thing to do would have been to implement some sort of payment pause or lower the principal on some of these mortgages to make it rational and possible for more people to stay in their homes. And rational and productive, not just for the residents, but for the banks too, who would have made more money by keeping the people in their homes than out. The FHFA, which controlled Fannie and Freddie or oversaw them, their head adamantly refused to implement this. But at the same time that they were refusing to implement sort of this principal payment pause, they were also selling off large tracts of homes to private equity firms. And they were doing it in bundles of dozens or hundreds of homes at a time. So nobody except institutional investors would be able to buy these up. As a result, private equity firms really got a foothold in the single family rental business that they just didn't before. I think before the Great Recession, at least by some reporting, no one institution owned more than 1,000 homes in the United States. As I understand it, Blackstone bought over 1,000 homes in a single day, I think in 2013. So it was just an absolute sea change in sort of the nature of home ownership. And so as a result, according to reporting and research, you've really seen whole neighborhoods change. And I think one of the things that gets lost in some of the reporting is it really is a neighborhood by neighborhood change. Many neighborhoods in America are completely unaffected, but others are, now, according to some reporting, it's the same people living in these neighborhoods, but now they are overwhelmingly renting the homes that they used to live in. And so in terms of the solutions here, part of it is, having or enforcing adequate tenant protections if we're going to have sort of the stock of single family rentals. California, for instance, has had a long fight over whether to extend the kind of tenant protections that exist in multifamily homes, so apartment buildings, to single family rentals. And Blackstone, I think, committed something like $8 million to the campaign to fight that change. Blackstone was successful at that time. So, part of it is just getting the basics down in terms of tenant protections. But the other is thinking about, are there reasonable limitations that should be put on investor acquisitions of large tracts of homes? Maybe it makes sense for somebody to own one or two or three, homes, but does it make sense for, as Senator Sherrod Brown said about, I think it was either Cincinnati or Cleveland, that a single investor owned 29 homes just on one street? And does allowing those kinds of acquisitions change the nature of a city or a town? And does it change the nature of home ownership and people's ability to enter and stay in the middle class? So I think that this is an area where private equity is really active. I also think it's an area where I think, as you're saying, institutions like states and localities can really play a leading role here. And so in that sense, I'm very hopeful and excited.
Yeah, I hope that we can find some paths. In that vein, in each chapter of your book, you identify problems and you identify some potential solutions. And the last chapter of the book is a more thoughtful distillation of the solutions, the ways that people in all their different situations can work to change the economic realities of what we now call and think of as private equity, so that it becomes a more constructive part of our economy. Walk us through, if you would, some of your favorite things that we should be doing, at the state and local level, at the, as activists, as shareholders, as whatever we may be. What are the things we should be doing?
Sure. Well, let me just start very specifically about, the people in this conversation who are interested in learning more. There are a number of organizations that I think are doing great work on this stuff. And I think it's helpful to just get on their email lists to just understand what's going on. Americans for Financial Reform, the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, American Economic Liberties Project. All three of those are doing, interesting, important work and are worth learning more about. At the policy level, one of we were talking about states and localities. One of the things that I've always been interested in is, could we get city councils or state legislatures to ban specific extractive tactics for businesses in their jurisdictions? So you can say, okay, you can buy the local business of 200 employees that's headquartered in our town, but if you then execute transaction fees and management fees that drive the company into bankruptcy, we're going to hold you responsible for making the employees whole. Or we're going to say, you can't, if you execute a sale leaseback that, essentially makes the business unsustainable, again, we're going to hold you, the private equity firm, financially responsible there. There are really interesting sort of legal, almost constitutional questions about some of these things. And no doubt, a lot of this would get litigated. But I think that there's a real legal foundation, I'm speaking very personally here, for exploring some of these ideas. And in a world where, Congress has got a lot on its plate, states and localities might be, one of the areas where you're going to see the most action over the next few years. So at the federal level, I think a lot of actions can happen among regulators to help address sort of the sort of incentive problems that we were talking about. So, we can have the SEC, in financial, require private equity firms to, stick to their fiduciary obligations, to actually, disclose the levels of debt that they're putting on companies and the kinds of fees that they're extracting. The Treasury Department or Federal Reserve could potentially designate some private equity firms as systemically important and subject to sort of regulation that thus far these firms have managed to avoid. In a world where, some of these firms now have $1 trillion in assets under management, I don't think it's a big stretch to think that that the failure of one of these firms could have sort of systemic effects on our finance system and our economy. And then finally, I think regulators can be looking at actions in specific industries. So, private equity firms are very interested in nursing homes. The Department of Health and Human Services, for the first time, is pushing forward national minimum staffing criteria, establish minimum baseline staffing requirements for nursing homes. If that were implemented, it's possible that the tragedies that we were talking about with Manor Care might not have happened. You know, similar sort of issue-specific advocacy could happen at the the FCC around prison phones, you know, Department of Education around for-profit colleges, you know, housing and urban development for mobile homes and so forth. So there's a big range of things that can happen here. All that we really need is the sort of public energy and enthusiasm and the commitment to work on them, because I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this or overly optimistic, but I've seen real success on some of these issues when people get motivated, and I'm hopeful that they get more motivated.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's just been an extraordinarily valuable discussion. Your insights are profound. We're grateful to you. Thank you very much for being with us. Again, Brian put the link to your book, Brendan, in the chat so everyone can see that link. I encourage you all to get a copy. It's one of those books that's hard to put down. It'll make you angry and it'll change your thinking about a lot of things. So again, Brendan, thank you. Brian, do you want to close things up?
Sure. Just to thank everyone for attending. We have been recording, so we will make this available to everyone on behalf of the CPA. Please tune in for other events we're holding approximately on a monthly basis. And so again, Brendan, thank you for raising the awareness on all these issues. We really are glad that that you've written a book such as this, and we will be advocates and spreading the word as well. So with that, we'll end everything. Yep. And
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.